All right. So, a couple things off the top. We've got that fifth final pack back due at the end of the day on Tuesday. So, I'll mention this again in class on Tuesday. Just a reminder, it's not for class, it's due at the end of the day Tuesday. So you get one more reminder, but I would get on, get that done, get it out of the way, so you can kind of see what your final pack back grade would be once the due date passes. The only other thing we still have will be an in-class quiz today, and then a module 13 quiz, which will pop up shortly after class and be due at the end of the day on Monday. Okay. So one thing that I already did. Give us a second here. So you're looking at grades. We're thinking about getting in. So I've had some people ask me questions, and I can try to hide some of this. I think I've got some options that I can maybe clean up so there's not causing confusion. But I wanted you to be able to see things that you submitted that aren't necessarily being kind of factored into your grade. So those are things that maybe I scaled up. So I wanted to save your original submissions or things that had an error that I fixed. So that's what's in those imported assignments and assignments category. These are just placeholders so that when I'm like copying and pasting things, they don't get put in categories to count towards your grade. Notice they're not being counted towards your grade at all, right? If you go to that grades tab and look here, these are the only things that are counting. So I don't know why the default is to due date, but if you go to assignment group here under grades and apply, we wait, there we go. So you can kind of see, so here's everything in all those quizzes that are currently being counted towards your quiz grade. You can also do a similar thing by going to the assignments tab. Go to show by type, and it kind of shows you, okay, what in that quiz category is being counted? Quizzes 1 through 12, also that regrade, not the original one, right? The one where I regraded and gave people credit. Same kind of idea with the class participation. Now, what I've done, and I think I did this Tuesday, was after we don't have any more module readings. So if you look at the syllabus, I dropped the lowest one. So what your grade is with the lowest drop is now being reflected by this, right? Your grade out of 100. So if you're using that figure out your grade tool, kind of putting in your grade out of 100 in each category, this will be the final grade that is used. It's your module reading score with your lowest drop. Now I still have the module reading category down here somewhere, there it is, with all the original submissions, right? But I've now kind of have Canvas reflecting what your grade is from that category with the lowest drop. I'll do a similar thing after class today because we'll have all the in-class quizzes done. So I'll get that updated. So there's what looks like another category. So I'm going to change this to 0. Won't be counting towards your grade. I'll put up something that says in-class quiz with 4 lowest dropped or something along those lines. And that'll tell you what your grade is in that in-class quiz category with your 4 lowest dropped. Okay. And then after Monday's class, probably won't have it done before we meet on Tuesday, so the due date is the end of the day. But after class on next Tuesday, I'll do the same thing for the quiz. And how many of those do I drop? Go back to the syllabus. I'll drop the 2 lowest quiz grades there. Okay. So then going into the final, you'll have an idea about what your grade in each category looks like with the lowest drop. Now there's different number drop in each one, right? 2 of your lowest quizzes, 4 in-class quizzes, 1 module reading. And then obviously the where are they at? Oh, your exam scores, right? Okay, so you'll see those changes being made on Canvas. Hopefully that becomes a little bit more clear, like what exactly the number that's being factored or counted towards your grade is in each one of those categories, and also gives you this really updated idea of with those lowest dropped. Okay. Hearing a lot of murmur. Any questions on that? We're good? Okay. So let's go back here. I'm going to leave student view for a second. There we go. So all we have left is to kind of go through the rest of monopolistic competition. I'll skate through some of the stuff on the slides today, but I'm not going to really test you on. I just think it's interesting to have the discussion. So we might spend a little bit less time on the slides and a little bit more time because me drawing some things out here today. And then next class, next week, Tuesday and Thursday, it's just going to be review. So whatever questions you have, if you looked at old practice problems, old quizzes, If you've looked at this practice final, which I put up on Tuesday as well, right? These will all be kind of good materials for you to bring to have, ask me questions on. I have all of them with me so I can answer questions on anything. Okay? If you also, maybe there's something where, could you do an example of this? I can come up with problems on the fly and try to give you examples of things that maybe you've been struggling with that give you a slightly different view as opposed to just looking at the same problem over and over. So if you do a problem that looks like this, right? Then maybe I change increase to decrease or some things like that. Okay? So next week, I think would be highly valuable to be in class. Won't be any in-class quizzes. I guess you have to weigh out your marginal benefits and costs, but I would think that the marginal benefit is insanely high next week. Okay. All right. Any questions before we dive into material now? I think that should be everything. Okay. So we left off last class thinking about, there we go, monopolistically competitive markets. So today we're going to think about a little bit harder the comparison of this market to the other two extremes, perfectly competitive monopoly, and then also some of the things that are going to influence these firms' decisions. So we said, when we look at these firms, it looks very similar to monopoly market in that they're making the decision, the profit maximizing quantity is where the twice as steep marginal revenue curve, twice as steep as demand, hits my marginal cost. We then go up to that demand curve to figure out the price. Now we said the difference, we started putting some names to names of some of these things. The difference between price and marginal cost, we were calling that the markup of the firm. Okay. You can almost think about it as what's price. When I sell something, it's the additional revenue. My marginal cost, the additional cost. So that markup is almost like representing for every unit I sell, what is my marginal profits? You can kind of think about it that way. So we would like a high markup, right? High additional profits from selling these goods. Now, one thing we said in the long run, because firms can enter and exit, it works a little bit differently in a perfectly competitive market. In a perfectly competitive market, when firms entered and exited, what changed? The equilibrium. So more firms or fewer firms, supply would shift, which would change the equilibrium price. Which remember, for perfectly competitive firms, what is their demand curve? Simply the price. So by firms entering and exiting, increase or decrease that price until in the long run, profits will equal to 0. It's a similar idea with monopolistic competitive markets. It's just that there's not one single price, right? What happens as firms enter the market? So let's say we've got positive profits, firms enter the market. What's going to shift from a monopolistic competitive firm? Well, just like the perfectly competitive market, what shifted? Their demand curve. The demand curve will shift for the monopolistic competitive market because we now are sharing the same market demand, but it's being split across more firms. So if firms enter, what happens to the demand curve for the monopolistic competitive firm? It's going to decrease, right? Which would then lower the price until in the long run, we said profits will be equal to 0. So we get the same long run result, and it is really operating the same way, right? It's operating through shifts in demand curves. It's just that when we were looking at perfectly competitive markets, the demand curve was just the equilibrium price. And so it was kind of decreases in that equilibrium price, looked like decreases in that demand curve. Here, same thing. It's now we face a downward sloping demand curve. And that will decrease until prices decrease to the point where when our profits equal to 0, when price is exactly equal to average total cost. Okay. So it's kind of where we left off, right? Kind of just some review of some of the things that we talked about. We stopped at this long run point. Okay. Now, here I've got one, an example where we can start to think about if I'm comparing the monopolistically competitive market to a perfectly competitive market. A perfectly competitive market is going to choose where the profit maximizing quantity will be where what? Supply is equal to demand. So where would the allocated efficient or the perfectly competitive quantity for this firm? Where that marginal cost, the supply curve, hits demand, so it'll be out here. That's where total surplus is maximized, right? Perfectly competitive markets, where the allocated efficient markets, total surplus is maximized. We've got a monopolistically competitive market. They don't make a decision based on the demand curve, but they're setting a single price. They're going to have a twice the steep marginal revenue. They actually choose a lower quantity. So if there's units that we're no longer producing that we were in a perfectly competitive industry, all of those units we're going to be losing what on? So the difference between supply and demand for every single one of those units would represent deadweight loss or a loss of surplus there. So we're going to have deadweight loss that exists from monopolistically competitive power, just like we did for monopoly. Now, just to point out a few things here. Is this in the long or the short run? How do you know it's in the short run? So I didn't put up an average variable cost curve here. So like an easy way is if there's an average total average variable cost that are different. Why do I know? Almost gave you the answer. Why do I know I'm in the short run here? Well, at this price, what's true about price relative to my average total cost? So my profits must be positive. If I have profits anything other than zero, I'm in the short run. Right? I know that if firms can freely enter next to this market, what will firms choose to do? Enter, pushing profits back down until they're zero. Okay. So it's kind of where we left off. I'll kind of give you this comparison, and then I'll break it down, I think, in a slightly different way. I want to show you the visual here first, and then I'll do some different stuff. So if I have a perfectly competitive market, monopolistically competitive, we know that for these perfectly competitive firms, they're going to end up in the long run at the minimum point of that average total cost curve, right? And so this is where price is equal to average total cost, profits are equal to zero. Now over here for the monopolistic competitive market, they're still setting a price where it's equal to, or at least I tried to have these drawn close, where it's equal to the average total cost. So profits are still zero, but notice they're not at the minimum point of their average total cost curve. Excuse me. So the quantity we see them choose relative to this efficient scale or the perfectly competitive quantity is going to be a little bit lower. So the efficient point for society, or the efficient point for this market, you would say, is where per unit costs are at their lowest. What are per unit costs? My average total costs. So we said a perfectly competitive market will get to the lowest possible per unit cost possible in the long run. I guess it's possible more than I needed to on that one, but we're going to end up at that minimum point. So this difference between that efficient quantity that the perfectly competitive firm will get to, or the market will get to, relative to the monopolistically competitive firm, that difference we said was we were going to call, and I think I've got it here, excess capacity. Okay. So it's basically the number of units that we should be producing to get to that lowest per unit cost. But firms don't care about just costs, they care about profits. So the monopolistic competitive firm, they're actually maximizing profits. It's kind of weird, but profits are their highest in the long run when they are zero. If they actually were to produce out of that efficient point, they would actually end up with negative profits. That's not as good as zero. So we've got this excess capacity. We kind of already talked about the markup, the difference between price and marginal cost. And we said we've got this deadweight loss that exists. So the quantity that a monopolistic competitive market gets to in the long run will be lower. And what's going to be true about the price? So I tried to kind of have this dashed line. So here's the price of a perfectly competitive firm. Price of a monopolistic competitive market will be a little bit higher. What does that sound similar to? Who also charges a higher price and sells a lower quantity? Monopolists. So now we'll think about kind of how do we compare, or how do we enter the monopoly into the chat, so to speak. So I'll give you a visual, and then I'll give you like, I think an easy way, like a little table thing to remember this, okay? So it gets kind of tricky. Okay. So if I've got market demand, and then here I've got marginal cost or supply. Okay. So the easy one is where will the perfectly competitive market get to? Where supply is equal to demand. Now here we're looking at the entire market, okay? And here would be kind of that perfectly competitive quantity. Now, if I have a monopolist, they start to make decisions based off of a what? They still face all of market demand, right? They're the only firm. But instead of making decisions based off demand, they make decisions based off of a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So this is like the monopolist's marginal revenue. So here's the quantity of the monopolist. They then go up. What is the last consumer willing to pay? to set the price. Okay. So if I'm just thinking about, this is kind of a review of things we've looked at. So if I'm thinking about the monopolist relative to my perfectly competitive market, the quantity is going to be lower and the price is going to be higher. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky to put all of these on the same graph. So when we were looking at this, this is at the firm level. Okay? So we know the firms are going to end up in that lowest point of their average total cost curve, but for monopolist competitive, they're going to be not quite at that minimum thing. So we know that every single firm is producing at a lower quantity and a higher price. So if you think about if I was looking at like the average firm where I was adding these all up to figure out kind of what would the average market price and average and kind of total market quantity be, so I can compare the markets, not just the firms. Well, if every firm is going to choose a lower quantity than a perfectly competitive market, when I add them all up, what's going to be true about the monopolistically competitive market's quantity? Relative to perfectly competitive quantity, it'll be every firm is producing a lower amount, and add them all up, the market will be at a lower value. Think about this way: if I have 10 firms, perfectly competitive market, they're all choosing to produce 10, I've got 100. Monopolistically competitive market, they're not choosing 10, they're only choosing 9, I will only have a market quantity of 90. All right, so we can kind of do the analysis at the firm level and then know, oh, the same thing would apply to the market. Now, putting it on this graph, I would actually need like market demand. So I would have to kind of add up every single firm's demand curve. So instead of kind of mudding this graph up too much, ultimately what we know is if each firm is going to face a smaller portion of demand, there's now some competition. What's going to happen to my demand curve? It's going to be a little bit more, more elastic or a little bit flatter. So without kind of throwing it on here, just to kind of give you a visual though where the point would be, if I was to plot where the monopolistically competitive quantity and price would be, well, do they have as much market power as a monopolist? No, there's no substitutes. They would face a very inelastic demand curve. So I know that it's going to be somewhere in between a monopoly and a perfectly competitive market, right? And I know that the price they'll set, where we're at in the demand curve, is going to be a little bit higher than the perfectly competitive market, but lower than a monopoly market. You can almost just think about it this way, like as we're going from a monopoly to monopolistically competitive, perfectly competitive, what's happening to competition? We're getting more competition. So just intuitively, what's that going to do to the price? Lower the price. And then maybe not quite as intuitively, but what that's going to do is end up with a higher overall quantity in that market. So this little table maybe is an easy way to kind of remember that directional change as we're comparing these three types of markets. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. So I think I've got some stuff in the slides, but I'll just start talking about it and we'll see which bullet points I forget. So the next thing we'll talk about in kind of setting it up, just so we can think about some of these things that will impact monopolistic competitive firms, is going to be advertising. Okay. So why would I want to advertise the company? What does that do to my costs? Increases my costs. Right? It's a bad thing. Right? But what am I expecting then? If I'm increasing my costs, why would I want to advertise? I'm also expecting more people want to buy from me. Right? Now, this can operate in two ways. Right? So the first way, I'll kind of think about the role of elasticity, and then we'll think about, well, what if I'm just grabbing a larger portion of overall demand? Okay. So the first way, let's think about when I'm spending money on advertising, what am I really doing? So I've got my quantity and price. So let's say there's something like energy drinks, right? And I've got my marginal costs. What do I want here? Let's do So I face not a horizontal demand curve, but there's a lot of different types of energy drinks. Like it's a pretty competitive market. Now, each product tries to differentiate themselves, right? Monster, Bang, whatever, you know, your energy drink of choice is anyway. But it's still going to be pretty elastic, right? If you go in and you see one of them is $2 higher or $1 higher, you might buy the other, right? There's substitutes available, right? So what are they trying to do with advertising? So before we have that discussion, where would their profit maximizing quantity be? And where would their profit maximizing price be? Okay. So they go up to the demand curve to set that price. Now, what's true? Okay, there we go. So we can identify that markup, which is the difference between the price and the marginal cost of that firm. Now, in advertising, let's just assume I don't get a larger portion of demand, but let's just zero in on what if I can convince consumers that there's not a substitute for my product? So if I can convince consumers Monster energy drinks, nothing is like it. Whether nothing has as much caffeine or nothing has quite as many, I don't know, whatever else they put in it. What am I doing to the elasticity of the demand curve? If there's fewer substitutes, demand is going to become more inelastic. So you could think about, what if I have a scenario here where I've got this more kind of inelastic demand curve? Here's my marginal revenue curve. So the quantity is here. We go up here to set, well, didn't leave myself enough room, price. What I wanted to kind of get at with this idea is one of the benefits of advertising is here, I'm not even thinking about getting a larger portion of demand. Like in theory, like what's probably going to happen by advertising, I'm not only going to change people's minds that I am the only product, more people are going to buy my product. So we would have like a shift in demand at the same time as a change in elasticity. Here, I just want to single out, let's just assume we only changed the elasticity of demand. We didn't get any more consumers. We only made our consumer base more inelastic. So if they're more inelastic, notice what's happened to that markup. Try to draw it, you know, hopefully large enough where we can see it's going up, right? That difference between price and marginal cost is going to be a little bit higher. So you can kind of think about like the rule here is, as something becomes more inelastic, which we can do by spending money on advertising, we're able to increase that difference between price and marginal cost, which I said you can almost think about as kind of like a marginal profit. So a firm is going to enjoy having this higher markup. Any questions on this idea? So here for the rest of class, I'm going to single out certain things. In practice, they're probably all going to be happening at the same time. So it would be unfair for me. Well, I shouldn't say it'd be unfair. I'm not going to ask you to kind of put them all together, but this was the first one. If I am advertising, if I can change the elasticity of demand for my product, making it more inelastic, I can increase my markup. Generally, that'll be a good thing for profits. Now, what I didn't put on here is the fact that, well, how did I have to do that? I spent a bunch of money on advertising. Okay. So let's think about the other impacts of spending a bunch of money on advertising. So let's assume now, so we're going to single out a different type of effect, which is that, so I've got my constant marginal costs, and let's say here's my demand curve, twice as steep marginal revenue curve, and I'm going to start out, well, scratch this. I think it'll make more sense for you guys to see it this way instead. So marginal cost, demand curve, twice as steep marginal revenue curve, And let's do here's my average total cost curve. Okay. So I'm starting out with this firm, and at the profit maximizing price and quantity, their profits are equal to what? Well, price is equal to my average total cost. So we're starting out with 0 profits. Okay. If I spend a lot of money on advertising, what's going to happen to my marginal cost of production? Well, if I spend money on advertising and I produce nothing, what are my costs? How much I spent. What if I produce 1 million units? It's still the same. Essentially, advertising is what type of cost? It doesn't depend on how much I produce, so it's a fixed cost, right? So if we think about if I'm spending more money on advertising, what am I doing? I'm not really changing my cost of productions in terms of my per unit, my marginal costs. But what I am doing, you could think about it as, I'm going to try to draw these as parallel as I can. Well, I messed up a little bit, but here's my average total cost, right? I've increased my average total costs, okay? Now, if I do that, so let's think of a scenario, we'll kind of try to connect all the dots, connect these dots. If I have 2 firms, and let's say they both agree not to advertise, they split demand evenly, and maybe they've got positive profits. However, if I'm the one firm that advertises, what's going to happen? I'm going to get a larger portion of the overall demand curve. What are likely going to happen to my profits if I advertise and the other firm doesn't? I'm going to get a lot more consumers. I'm going to have more market power, so my profit is likely going to be even higher than it was before. So there's this incentive to break the agreement of not advertising, right? Where we're keeping our costs low. Because even though I increase my cost, I grab a much larger portion of the overall demand. Now, if we both advertise, what are we back to? Well, if we did the same amount, we're splitting demand still. But now what have we done? Increase our costs. So relative to when we both weren't advertising, when we both are, our profits would be lower. So we end up with this Nash equilibrium where both firms advertise. Well, that would be an example of a prisoner's dilemma because they now have profits that are lower than if they could stick true to this agreement. So notice here, let's assume that we end up in that equilibrium where both firms are advertising, so their costs go up, but they don't change the portion of the demand curve that they get. What's going to happen? Well, their marginal revenue, marginal cost hasn't changed. What's going to be true about their profits? Price is going to be way below average total cost. So remember our profit equation, burn this into your memory going into the exam. Price times quantity times the difference between price and average total cost. So if price is below average total cost, my profits here would be negative, right? So in this second scenario, you can kind of think about, here's my new average total cost. Think about this whole area here would represent negative profits under that second scenario. So I spent money on advertising, but so did the other firm. We just increased our costs. Nobody sold any more consumers. We're actually worse off. I went from 0 profits to negative. Okay. Are you with me so far? This is going to get a little bit complicated or a little bit more muddy here. Now, what's likely to be the case is that if I spend money on advertising, well, I shouldn't say likely to be the case. Let's look at the second scenario. Why did we say we want to spend money on advertising? In theory, I should get a larger portion of the overall demand curve. So if I am able to do that, and here I'll draw it kind of as a big one, but I'll draw it parallel. So we didn't change the elasticity. I'm trying to kind of keep elasticity and slope are 1-to-1, but they're related. So we're trying to keep that the same. Twice as steep marginal revenue curve here. And here, instead of 2, I'll kind of call this scenario 3, where like this scenario is that we spent money on advertising, but we didn't get any more demand. Now, let's assume we did spend money on advertising, but we also got a larger portion of overall demand curve. Where's the new profit maximizing quantity? Way up here, right? Where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. I can then set my price way up here. What's true about the difference between my price and my average total cost now? price is above average total cost. So these would be profits that are positive. So advertising would only make sense because we know it's going to increase our costs, which we said we know that if it doesn't change how much of demand we get or doesn't shift our firm's demand curve, we could go from having zero profits to negative, or we see a decrease in profits. So what must be true is those are compensated for by the fact that if I'm spending money in advertising, in order for it to be profitable, I'd have to be selling to a larger percent of the consumer base, right? I'd have to be getting that increase in demand as well. And that increase in demand is what's going to drive my profits up. Okay. Questions over anything here before we keep moving? Does this help with the colors at all? No? Yes, no, not really. I don't know what settings they changed on this, but I feel like it's a little bit washed out here. Okay. That's why I was trying to use numbers so we can kind of think about it. Okay. So 3 things ultimately that we know are going to impact kind of these firms. So I could just have a huge fixed cost that could change my profits. Shifts in demand. We kind of talked about that last week. That was even the idea as firms enter and exit. We were getting a larger, smaller portion of the overall demand curve. Or changing the elasticity for my product through advertising. Okay. Excuse me. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? So let's see what I forgot. So this idea of advertising, right? Economists kind of go back and forth. We'll talk about some things that I maybe didn't mention. So some critics would say, you know, ultimately we're just wasting resources, right? So if you think about if those companies were putting that money towards things like research and development, we had even better products, we would have higher marginal benefit for consumers. But we're not, right? We're not getting in these advertising wars, possibly getting into the prisoner's dilemma. Where not only are consumers worse off, the companies are going to be worse off as well. You know, the other argument would be, I know once again, I'll kind of gloss over different stuff, but it's interesting. I'm starting to try to talk more about like the real world and how we start to think about this. If advertising doesn't really change your actual, so if the benefit you get from consuming something doesn't change, but a company convinces you that the benefit is going to be a lot higher, are you going to buy more or less than what is optimal? So you're going to buy more than what is optimal. Right? You actually should have bought less to make your surplus the highest, right? So think about it this way, like, oh, I don't know. My wife saw something for our son. You think what was something? So I digress. But they're like these like things you should put over them so they don't pee on you, basically. They are worthless. Honestly, some Instagram ad convinced her that they were going to have the, oh, this is going to make diaper changes so much better, right? They don't, right? So what happened? She bought way more of them than what is optimal in our household. What is optimal in our household is to not use them, it's just zero. They're worthless, right? So anytime that a company convinces you something brings you value that it actually won't, you're going to buy too much of it, which is ultimately going to result in lower surplus, right? Deadweight loss. So that would be kind of the one, another way to think about it. You know, but we can defend it a little bit in that what if advertising, so I think we think about it as like these major companies are spending a lot of money, and it used to be this way because really the only advertising you could get out there that had a huge impact was on TV. But now, what can you spend maybe not near as much money on and have way more reach? Social media. So actually one defense of advertising would be that these smaller firms are actually able to get the word about their product out there more, creating more competition. We said as we have more competition moving towards that perfectly competitive point, what's happening to deadweight loss? It should be going down. Right? We're getting closer to that point where total surplus is maximized. So that would be kind of one defense of advertising, why it could be valuable for society. It also just allows people to find, like, I go back 30 years. This it made a lot more sense to talk about, I guess, in a way. But what can happen if we have advertising is it allows consumers to get a better idea about prices. Problem is, like, it used to be way too expensive to do that. And so only big companies could afford national TV ads, or even about what their price might be. So like local companies had a really hard time of even making you aware that they might have a lower price. Well, now with the internet, everyone has a phone in your pocket, you can always just look up whatever you want to buy and instantly find tons of different prices, right? So advertising, it still works, right? The concept still applies. It's just now you don't have to spend near as much money, and you can get ads going on social media where it's targeted consumer basis. So what is that going to do? Well, it's going to, you might initially think, well, gives them more monopoly power. But if everyone's doing that, now you can shop around. So what's going to happen? Are you going to be more or less sensitive to price changes? Less, so you're going to become more elastic. If you can be really, really elastic, it starts to look like a perfectly competitive market. So that would be one defense of advertising, is that can actually kind of help like equate the prices amongst these big firms and these small firms, where giving just buyers more information, right? And once again, I won't kind of be asking specific questions to this. We're just thinking about what this would look like in the world. There was a study about eyeglasses, though, which was kind of interesting. They found in places where they prohibited advertising, so they didn't allow them, that eyeglasses actually end up being more expensive. So there's once again, this was like, the study was done kind of prior to like the boom of the internet, everyone having a phone in their pocket with the internet available. But before they allowed advertising, they actually found that eyeglasses were more expensive, which this would be a defensive advertising, right? It must have been that companies weren't able to get out what their prices were, and so consumers weren't able to know that there might be better deals available and end up actually paying higher prices. So we see this kind of play out in the real world. Just to kind of mention and briefly, I got one more thing I want to work through. But you can also say it could be a signal of quality, right? So if a company is willing to spend money on advertising, they must really believe in their product, which means that maybe the marginal benefit actually is higher. And so that would be another kind of advantage. Now, to really build a lot of this stuff into our models, it would become a little more complicated. So we have our basic models of a monopolistic competitive market. It gets a lot trickier as we kind of want to add in some of these things like signals of quality. But this would be kind of topics you would tackle if you took the next level of microeconomics, right? Most of you are probably just going to take 252, which is a lot more macro based, but kind of introducing the idea to some degree. Advertising is basically the same as branding. I don't want to waste too much time on it. But what I do want to kind of focus on are these long run outcomes. So we said the monopolistic competitive market will still end up where profits are equal to zero, price is equal to average total cost. It's just we're not going to be at that minimum point of the average total cost curve. Okay. So we've got these two terms that we've already talked about: excess capacity, market over marginal cost. So I went a little bit out of order. I kind of made those comparisons early on in the class. We were comparing to that perfectly competitive market. This is just kind of a summarization of that. And then, is this a bad thing for society? Well, we talked about there is some deadweight loss that exists, but potentially the discussion is a lot more complicated, right? When we have all of these, different signals of quality, or, increased competition through allowing consumers to have a better idea about what prices are out there. So it becomes a little bit more tricky to really analyze these monopolistic competitive markets than those two extremes that we've been comparing them to. Okay. I won't waste too much time here. Get you out of here a little bit early today, but there's a couple more things that we got to get through. So let's do quiz now. All right, so we got two questions here. We kind of already had this built out, so we'll reference this again. But I'll do this in a way. So this first question, we're basically comparing these different types of markets. So we kind of already did this, but I want to give you a little bit more insight as to what's going on here. So here was kind of the market level, right? If I wanted to instead look at my firm level, so here I've got my average total cost. I've got my marginal cost. Let's see here, I want my demand curve, and my marginal revenue curve, right? So if I'm looking at things instead of on the market level, at the firm level, where would the perfectly competitive firm choose to be here? So it gets kind of tricky because I've got like this average total cost curve in here. But if we were just thinking about where would the allocative efficient quantity be, where is supply equal to demand? That would be out here at this quantity, okay? Now, under a perfectly competitive market, it actually wouldn't be here because what's going to happen, the demand curve is going to shift. So we're going to end up with kind of a horizontal demand curve. But if we're just thinking about like at the firm level, we're not thinking about the market level here where supply is equal to demand, just supply is equal to demand for the firm, okay? So what's the equilibrium price going to be here? Wherever supply is equal to demand. What about for the monopolistically competitive firm? Well, once again, where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost for them? Down here, they go up to the demand curve. Now I try to draw this in a way that, am I in the long or the short run here? So what's true? My price is equal to my average total cost. So we said our profit equation, if price is equal to average total cost, what must profits be? 0, right? So if we're comparing a monopolistically competitive firm to a perfectly competitive firm, they're going to produce a lower quantity and a higher price. Now, we then said if we want to take that logic and apply it to the market, that same thing would hold true, right? If I have 10 firms and perfectly competitive world, they're producing 10 units, monopolistic competitive, they're only producing 9, my market quantity is going to be lower. I also know if they're all charging higher prices, my average price is going to be higher than the perfectly competitive market. Now, for a monopolist, we're essentially just giving, you can think about it this way, we're combining two things we already talked about today. The first was, what happens when a firm gets a larger portion of the overall market demand? What's going to happen to the price they charge? It's going to go up. We also talked about if I'm the only seller of a good, oh, where did I put it? My product is becoming more inelastic, right? That's also going to allow me to kind of have more of a markup. So we're thinking about these monopolies relative to the monopolistic competitive markets. They're going to have more market power, which means they're going to restrict quantity even more, and they're going to be able to get away with charging an even higher price. There's not as many substitutes. Okay. So this is, once again, you can have this visual if it helps. Really, all you would need is this to answer questions like we have in the in-class quiz. So what's going to be true about the monopolistic competitive quantity? It's going to be less than a perfectly competitive market, greater than a monopolist. The price they'll charge will be greater than a perfectly competitive market, but less than the monopolist. So what do we have here? Which of the following? Well, I can't spell apparently. Type these out too fast. True. There we go. So, oh, and now I went back too far. All right. So we're working through this one together, so I won't go too crazy here. So prices are going to be higher than monopolists? No, right? We said they'd actually be a little bit lower. Quantity is going to be lower than a perfectly competitive market. Yes, that was the idea. We said they're going to have this excess capacity. So that's the one that is true. So everyone should get this correct. Right? A lower quantity than a monopoly market. So no, we're actually going to end up, there's more competition. So we're going to end up with lower prices and a higher market quantity. So that one's not true. And then a lower price in a perfectly competitive market. Perfectly competitive market, where we have the most competition possible, is going to be where that price is at its lowest, right? In terms of our markets, right? Comparing our markets. So the only one there that's true would be kind of that second one. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. Maybe I'll add a third question on here. So I'm not going to. I'm just being a jerk. So the second question, people are leaving as I'm going through this. Bad joke. All right. So question one, we got out of the way. Question two, everyone should get right here, right? I'm just asking you opinion based. I've got one more thing we'll work through after here. So once you get this submitted, there's one more thing I'll kind of show you that you might need for the quiz that you take this week. You know, for this, just answer next week on Tuesday and Thursday's class. Which of the following would you want to see reviewed the most? Okay. So let me go in here. Took a little bit longer to get through this. So I want to make sure when people submit this, it's not counting anyone's as wrong. So there we go. So the second one, you know, we've covered 4 modules, and that's all we're going to go through. That's all that's going to be on that final. So we did modules 10, 11, and 12. There's no correct answer to this last question. I think I have it set as something, but you'll get points for whatever. So perfectly competitive markets, monopoly markets, game theory or oligopolies, and then this week's monopolistic competitive zone, right? And some kind of market comparisons. And which one of those would you like to see reviewed the most next week? And I'll try to have kind of more impromptu questions available for whatever kind of those responses are. Now, you can ask any questions next week. Like I said, that practice final that's up there on Canvas now, practice problems, old quiz questions. You can ask anything. You can even ask, what if this changed in this problem? How would you work? You know, how would you solve it? Right. So next week is for you guys, right? I would imagine all of you want to be here if you want to do well in the final. It'll, I think, be very helpful to be in class next week. Okay. So make sure you're getting that submitted in the next 4 minutes. There's one more thing that I'll kind of give you that could be helpful for this week's quiz. Okay. So one thing we haven't done yet. So we've done shifts in demand. We've done shifts in the average total cost. We've done elasticity changes. So let's instead think about if I've got my demand curve, my marginal revenue curve, here I've got my marginal costs, okay? Where does marginal cost hit marginal revenue? Go up the demand curve to kind of set my price, okay? So what's going to happen? You could almost start out with a scenario. And if you wanted to put an average total cost, you could. So I try to draw it here where we start out with 0 profits. So let's say every firm in this industry currently is facing the same cost structure. We can all see what everyone's doing. We have the same available technologies. But now let's say one firm is able to come up with something and they're able to put a patent on it, right? Well, I don't know. Let's say they discovered some new way of organizing the production process. They can actually become more efficient, and they've lowered their marginal costs, okay? So if they lower their marginal costs here, what would also end up being true, and I'll try to draw this parallel here. Now, close to parallel. Part of my total costs were coming from my marginal cost, right? My variable cost here. So if I can somehow come up with something that lowers my costs, notice, where is my new profit maximizing price and quantity? Where does marginal cost hit marginal revenue now? Right, down here. What price can I get away with charging? So here's this kind of interesting. What's happened to the price that that firm is charging? It's actually lower. If I can lower my costs, I might actually to be even more competitive than I was before. I don't have to charge a price every other firm is. I can actually charge a lower price. More people are I'm going to be able to sell to more people. And what's happened to my profits now? Well, now the price I'm charging is above my average total costs. So what's true about my profits? They're no longer 0. There's some positive value. Right? Now, if I'm the only firm that's able to do this, I have like a patent or something on whatever this new technology is that lowers costs. Every other firm is still stuck up where profits are 0. In fact, it gets even more complicated because if this firm is selling more units, what's going to happen? It's stealing away. So some of the other ones, they're no longer going to have as much of demand as before. So if their demand curve shifts down, they're now going to actually end up at a quantity where they're selling a price where profits are now negative. So what's going to happen? Some of those firms would exit. So if there's firms that are able to kind of get this cost advantage, they can essentially like they're forcing some of those firms out of their industry. Is that a good or bad thing for them? Well, fewer firms means there is less competition, right? More inelastic demand. We talked about the advantages of that, right? So you can see like some of this stuff, I'm singling out one thing at a time. If it's all happening at the same time, it will get a lot more difficult to kind of work out what the end result is going to be. So for the sake of this class, if I ask you questions about anything, I'd be singling out one of these things, right? A change in elasticity, a change in the demand curve, just a change or a shift in the cost curve. In practice, all of them could be happening at the same time. I wouldn't do that too. I just kind of made it a time. Okay. All right. Any questions on that? So before you get all excited and get out of here. Module 13 quiz due the end of the day Monday. This is the last in-class quiz, so I'll get those points updated on Canvas. Enjoy what's left until 500. Get out of class a little bit early today with nice weather, and I will see you guys on Tuesday.